is definitely a new step for me, but also very similar from a technology point of view. And I've also recently joined up with CloudOps as their VP of Products. With so many co-located events this week, I'm thrilled that you've decided to start your Kubecon journey with us today. We've got many great sessions planned for the day that really go to showcase the extensibility of Tungsten Fabric as an SDN framework for Kubernetes, cloud, and edge computing use cases. A little bit on the housekeeping. The bathrooms are just out and around the corners. Lunch will be served at noon, and if you haven't already, there is a sheet at the back where you should sign your name so we know you actually attended this event. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Juniper and Redact, for helping to make this happen, as well as all of the other community members and organizations that help with logistics and planning and coordination of this event. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to probably the most familiar face in the Tungsten Fabric community, and our first speaker of the day, Randy Bias.
Hi. I'm not going to use the microphone. I'm just going to be loud. Everybody can hear me, right? Casey, can you hear me? Thank you. So just by way of background, I mean, how many people know who I am? Just keep it. Okay, so there's some new people. So my name is Randy Bias. I am sort of the principal open source agitator within Juniper Networks. And so when I was hired a couple of years ago, I think that they had come to the conclusion that some things were not going well with how they had done Open Contrail, which was the original Tungsten Fabric that Juniper had created from their Contrail SDN controller solution. And when I came in, I sort of realized that Juniper hadn't really done some of the key things that they needed to do. Namely, they had focused more on the licensing of Open Contrail and not on the community. And so I went to the community in early 2017, and I said, we need to do a reboot. And a reboot means that we transition from Juniper-led Open Contrail to community-led. And community-led means that all of you have to show up and help me do this, because if you don't, then it's just Juniper doing everything again. And that was hard for everybody. In some ways, it still is hard. But it was surprisingly as hard for many of the existing community members as it was for Juniper. I had people come to me and say, well, can't you just wave your wand and make a decision about the new name for Open Contrail, for example. And I say, no, I can't, because if I do that, then again, it's Juniper making decisions for the community instead of the community. So over the last couple of years, we've really been going through this process of trying to, reboot the community, get ourselves into the Linux Foundation and so on. And that's gone pretty well, right? And I'd say we're moving along at a nice clip now. As you can see, there's a good showing here today, considering it's a Monday morning at Kubecon, and people are just coming up to speed. So thank you for being here. In terms of my background, I'm a long-time infrastructure guy, networking, systems, all that kind of stuff. My information's on LinkedIn. You can go find it. It's super easy. And then somewhere along the line, I became cloud pundit, blogger, thought leader guy, and then one of the original pioneers of OpenStack, and sat on the OpenStack governing board for 3.5 years, and then parlayed all that into sort of being the open source strategist at Juniper. And so you can thank me for sort of all the chaos over the last couple of years. And that's a good time to talk about this. You turn this on yet? Now the battery's going to run out. There we go. All right. Click, click. Who doesn't know what Tungsten Fabric is? Okay, great. So there's a few people. Who knows do you know what software-defined networking is? Everybody? Okay, so Tungsten Fabric is an SDN solution that is open source that is designed to allow people to do software-defined networking and security. And so software-defined networking and security, for me, has always been sort of a fancy way of talking about cloud native, right? I think that, kind of as the cloud thing started going back in time a little bit, what I saw happen is VMware created a counter narrative kind of around 2009, 2010 called software-defined data centers. Anybody remember that? And that happened shortly after their Nicira acquisition, who had coined the term software-defined networking. And that really sort of became this general meme, right? Now people talk about software-defined storage, software-defined security networking, and so on. And for me, what that really means is cloud or cloud native. And the reason I say that is because the early lessons from cloud were, we not only want things on demand, but we want them through an API. We want them to be highly programmatic. We're building next generation of applications that are dynamic in nature. They scale up and down. They detect when there are failures. They route around these failures. And in order for that all to work, you need sort of an infrastructure layer that is highly dynamic and that's programmable in nature. So software-defined networking is really that element of that infrastructure that allows you to have a network model that's highly dynamic, on-demand, programmatic, instrumented, and so on. So Tungsten Fabric is one of the most successful SDNs out there. It's the #1 SDN in OpenStack. It's been running in production in many carriers for 4+ years now. Some of the folks that have been very public about it are folks like AT&T. Now CERN is evaluating it. They're going to move away from the technology they were using today, which is Neutron and OpenStack. They're sticking with OpenStack, but they're going to basically looking at replacing Neutron with Tungsten Fabric as well. And the reason is that CERN needs something that's highly scalable. So there are many things that you can ding Juniper on in terms of how they built the community and so on, but the one thing you cannot ding them on is the quality of the code and the proven scalability of the code of Tungsten Fabric. Right now, if we go out there, sort of our key differentiator is that we're the only truly enterprise-grade SDN solution that exists that is also open source. So there are competitors on the commercial closed source side that have the same depth and breadth of features, proven scalability that we do, but they're not open source. And then on the open source side, there are competitors, but none of them have the same depth and breadth and the proven scalability that we do. So that's really where Tungsten Fabric sits. That's why it's important. And that's why we, and I'm wearing my Tungsten Fabric hat here, believe that there's an opportunity to really claim the mantle of the #1 SDN, not just in OpenStack, but in open source more generally. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this today. There are some slides that have a timeline in here that you can look at offline. But like I said, over the last couple of years, once we started the reboot process, we were trying to figure out where to park this thing, right? And there are many different options, right? We could build our own foundation because there aren't enough open source foundations. Everybody should start one. And we had the option of going to some of the different foundations, which we evaluated. We had the option of going to something more like Apache Software Foundation, Linux Foundation, CNCF, and so on. And after working with the community, there was a whole working group that just kind of went through, looked at all the options. And after about 6-9 months, we decided the best place for us was the Linux Foundation. And part of the reason that we decided that is because the Linux Foundation was creating a new sub-foundation called the Linux Foundation Networking Fund. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the way that the Linux Foundation works is it's sort of a meta foundation. It has many of these sub-foundations. One of the most popular ones is the small foundation called the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. I think you all have heard of this by now, right? That's a sub-foundation of the Linux Foundation. So Linux Foundation Networking is really a sister to CNCF, and it's focused on open source networking tools, right? So we decided that would be a great place for us to land. So not just the Linux Foundation, but the Linux Foundation Networking Fund, because we'd be surrounded by like-minded projects, some of whom we had very deep relationships with, like DPDK. And, and it just wound up being sort of the best of all the different options we evaluated. So when we dig down, double-click one more into, why Tungsten Fabric, right? I said, hey, we got the most depth and breadth of any of the open source solutions. Well, to sort of take that a little bit further, part of what that means is that we can run on public cloud, we can run on private cloud, we can support VMs, we can support containers, we can support bare metal, we can program switches. Right, that's pretty amazing. And then some of what's started to happen recently that isn't as obvious is that we've started to become multi-data plane. And we don't even really talk about that too much, but we support vRouter today, which is our primary data plane, but we started to support things like AWS VPC. right? So we can actually program and manage a public cloud data plane. And we're looking at other options in the future, like rewriting the vRoute or having a vRoute alternative that runs on eBPF, right? And I think that we would even be open to somebody adding support for OVS or other data planes, because we believe the value in Tungsten is really around the control plane, the manageability, the scalability that's been proven. You can read that offline. iChart, lots of people are part of the community. This is a timeline again. You can look at this offline. I'm not going to go through this. But I do want to review kind of how things went in 2018. Since we're at the end, and as you know, at the end of every year, what you have to do is you have to review the year, and then you have to make your predictions for the next year, right? I have no predictions today, sorry. So we have been really focused this year on completing the migration to LFN, and that was just not as easy as I had hoped, right? There's been a lot of bumps along that path, but we're pretty close to closing that out. Part of that is that the Linux Foundation Networking Fund, TAC, the equivalent of their TSC or technical committee, which I'm on, really had a lot of requirements around, understanding, the community, understanding who was in it, who the contributors are, and so on. And we've been really working at trying to satisfy those requirements. And just follow through on the community processes. I think one of the things that is not as obvious if you're on the outside and you're not working in some of these communities kind of on a working group or one of the leadership groups is that, this stuff's not one and done, right? There's always sort of an evolution, right? So we got ourselves into the Linux Foundation Networking Fund, but then there was a lot of work to continue to clean up the charter, some of the processes, fix a bunch of the infrastructure, transition things out of Juniper and make sure it was run by the community and so on. So just a lot of follow through had to happen there. And then, coordination on next year. So I see this year as sort of the year that we spend a lot of time doing sort of the follow through on LFN, which happened at the beginning of the year, doing all the cleanup. And then hopefully next year, we're really going to hit it. And I've got some stuff that I want to share with you about what I think sort of our priorities should be. Again, you can go through this kind of later. One thing I will call out is that one of the outstanding items I'm super excited about is that we have a new architecture document for Tungsten Fabric. You can find it there. And what that means is that if you look, because we used to be Open Contrail and now are Tungsten Fabric, still a lot of supporting documentation on Tungsten Fabric is at opencontrail.org. We haven't really decommissioned Open Contrail. This is one of the biggest chunks of documentation that needed to be revised. It needed to talk about Tungsten Fabric and not Contrail over on Contrail, and it needed to just be updated to the latest versions. And a gentleman at Juniper, took this on. His name's Stuart Mackey. He got this done. And then the most important thing is that it was not a PDF this time, but was Markdown that was checked into a GitHub repo. So now anybody who wants to tweak the architecture documentation can get up there, check it out, make the changes, put in a pull request, and we can all start working on this kind of together, right? So there's a lot of that little stuff that's sort of the transition from the Juniper-led to the community-led that is still a little outstanding. And if you see places where you can jump in and fix something like that and you want my support or anybody else's support in the community to help you with that, I would love for you to lean in and do that work. And then this last thing we'll talk about a little bit more, which is we launched an evangelism program this year, and so far it's gone extremely well. So big thing here is we have a bunch of releases coming up, a bunch of marketing events. Really the focus in 2019 is going to be to get the word out, and in particular into certain communities like the Kubernetes community, that's why we're here, and into the enterprise. All right, so I worked with Robert here at the front to launch an evangelism program earlier this year. First, it started kind of as a nucleus incubated inside of Juniper. Now we started to move it out into the community. We'll be working with folks like Madison on the marketing group to sort of get the ball rolling. The objective was I sort of used Amazon Web Services early model as kind of our model. And in the early days of Amazon Web Services, and I mean like 2007, 2008, 2009, like early days, there was really just 5 evangelists in Amazon, like Jeff Barr, who went around and basically talked to small groups like this all the time. Like every week they would do it 2 or 3 times, and they just went all around the country, all around the world, and just spoke, and just really showed what you could do with the Amazon Web Services, because you can stand on the side of the street all the time and yell at people about something, but nobody's going to pay any attention to you. When you get up in front of a small group and you sort of talk about how you solve certain problems and you walk them through it, then they really pay attention, right? Then they're engaged, because almost everybody kind of shows up to these kinds of events to see if there's something that some problem that one of their peers has solved that helps them figure out how to solve the problem for themselves. And so we decided that we wanted a strategy of not just big events, right? Because organizations like the Linux Foundation, CNCF, they're geared up to do these big events, but they're not geared up to do small events. So it was really up to the Tungsten Fabric community to do sort of a grassroots, bottoms-up kind of evangelism program. So we needed several things in place, right? So first of all, the one thing we needed to do is we need to be able to make sure that people could spin up and evaluate Tungsten Fabric quickly. And up until this year, and really kind of midway through 2017, if you wanted to evaluate Tungsten Fabric, the answer was go install OpenStack and then evaluate it. And as anybody who's installed OpenStack knows, that is a non-trivial task. So we got to the point where we supported Kubernetes and CNI, and then my team that works directly for me built something called the Carbide evaluation system, Tungsten Carbide. And that is a CloudFormation-based template that spins up Kubernetes plus Tungsten Fabric, the latest version with CNI, onto AWS in 15 minutes. That's what you see when you go to tungsten.io/start. And so what we decided to do is figure out where all the global meetups were, who were the organizers, find out who in our community could be ambassadors, who could go and present in different locations across the world, match those up, do the matchmaking, make sure that they had some basic decks to present, and that they also were armed with Carbide. And then what we could do is we could take a look and we could say, for this many meetups per month, we had this many Carbide launches, and see if we were having any impact in driving people evaluating Tungsten Fabric through the grassroots meetups. And this gives you some idea where we're at. This is just for this year. The blue line is the number of meetups per month, and then the red line is the number of Carbide lunches per month, the AWS-based evaluation system. And as you can see, it just roughly correlates, right? Correlation's not causation, I know. But this is the best that we have at the moment, given it's an open source community. People opt in. I can't go track them. But what you can see is that it seems like there's a pretty clear impact, right? When we do a lot of meetups, when people come and they present in small venues like this, and they push Carbide, then we get people going and launching Carbide to take a look at Tungsten Fabric. And if we want to grow the community, if we want to get to 10,000 times more deployments, if we want to have many more people involved, then we have to drive interest. And as there's more interest, there will be more developers who want to develop on Tungsten Fabric, and there will be more people who want to deploy it and use it. Any questions about that?
Just one thing.
Yeah.
I'm just curious about the name Tungsten. How that came. Normally people choose name that is opposite to the competitors like Eclipse or Police and something.
Right. So the question is, how did Tungsten come about, the name? Yeah, that's worth talking about just for a second. Put this back to the graphics so you can hear me. So in the journey to get to the Linux Foundation, there were many things that had to happen. Many things from a legal perspective, from a process perspective, from a people perspective. And kind of one of the things we got to is we got to the point where it was very clear that we could not give open contrail to the Linux Foundation from a trademark perspective. Juniper was unwilling to have that sort of coincide with the Contrail commercial products that we ship, right? They wanted it to be different, right? It was too similar. And Linux Foundation said, you can give us Contrail and Open Contrail, but you can't just give us Open Contrail because it's too similar. So both sets of lawyers basically agreed that Open Contrail and Contrail were too similar from a trademark perspective. So either all of it had to go to the Linux Foundation, or all of it had to stay with Juniper. So we got into a position where we had to have a new name. And so as we went through the process of looking for new names, it went through a few iterations. The very first iteration We went through a process of, I don't know, 200 plus names, Robert, 230 plus names. We whittled it down to about 10. I took it to the people at Juniper, the executives who would make a decision about that, and they didn't like any of the 10 on my list, and they gave me an 11th. And the 11th one was the name Orchestrate. And I was like, no. Okay, first of all, we need a cool name. Second of all, we need some kind of name that sticks and is differentiated. And third, it just, it's got to say something about us. It could even be inaccurate, but like Orchestrate, like immediately begs, orchestrate what? I mean, it's like cloud, right? It's so overloaded as a term. So I restarted that process again. We whittled it down again. We tried to make it so that there would be a community decision instead of the Juniper executive's decision. That might have been a bad on my part. Don't ever ask, large corporate execs to make name decisions, right, for products. So we whittled it down to a much shorter list, 3 this time, and one of them was Tungsten Fabric. We went out to the community. We did a Survey Monkey. Had everybody vote on it. We got a ton of responses. How many responses did we get? I don't remember. 40, 50, something like that. So enough to get a good feel. And we got it down to 2, 3 to 2. And then we decided that of the 2, I forget the other one, but it was more problematic from a trademark perspective. Tungsten Fabric was more free and clear. And that's how we wound up on Tungsten. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, the way they came to a conclusion, the name makes sense. But how the name itself is selected.
Well, here's the thing, right? Here's what we learned when you ask people about names. They will never agree. And so do this mental exercise. Imagine you're at a large hyperscale company. You've got a container management system that you want to spin out, and you go and you start pitching it inside, and you say, hey, I got this great idea. Let's call it Kubernetes. Okay. I don't know for certain, but I'm pretty certain that at least 50% said, Kuber what? Like, that's a terrible name. Nobody knows what that is. It's like an old Greek word. It's not cool. Like, they're going to have to look it up, right? And then it kind of got its own brand. So I think the way that you should look at this is that Tungsten Fabric has an opportunity to establish its own brand. And in many ways, I fought tooth and nail. You have no idea how hard I fought to get Juniper to give Contrail and Open Contrail to the community. But then, you know what? After we rebranded in Tungsten Fabric, I totally changed my mind. And the reason I changed my mind was the Contrail and Open Contrail are deeply associated with Juniper, and Tungsten Fabric and the Tungsten Fabric community deserve to not be associated with Juniper over the long haul, right? That's what we want it to be. And so Tungsten Fabric is a completely different brand that's not really related to Juniper. And I understand it might be like, wow, it's kind of different, but I think you'll go into it. I think you're going to like it. And for what it's worth, most people, once they know it's Tungsten Fabric, either refer to it as Tungsten or TF. So that's pretty easy. Good?
Thank you.
All right. So on the meetups, just to give you some perspective, this is us last minute since like Q2 through Q4, so not the entire year. We've got 29 meetups done in 19 unique cities, 7 countries. Almost 1,400 people showed up, and that was, us putting the program together. So next year, I'm looking to quadruple these numbers. I'd like to get to the point where we have 10 meetups a month globally talking about Tungsten Fabric. And I'm not talking about Tungsten Fabric meetups. I'm talking about going to Kubernetes meetups, container meetups, Docker meetups, Mesosphere meetups, VMware meetups, OpenStack meetups, anywhere where there's anybody who's got any kind of compute orchestration system that needs networking, because they all do. We should be showing up and talking about why Tungsten Fabric is the best, why, and its core value. And not on these slides is that behind the scenes, I'm working with a lot of different people in the community to come up with more and more data points. We're doing a security review of the internal security architecture of Tungsten Fabric so that we can potentially use some of that as some data points about why we're the best. We're going to do some performance and benchmarking numbers. We're working on creating demonstrations on top of Carbide so that you can show specific workloads. And so as we go into next year, there will be more and more that ambassadors are armed with to go to particular meetups and talk about. Okay, so what was hard? So I said, we had all this fall through this year. And there are a number of ways in which that was hard. One of the biggest ones is that the way that we had built a lot of the community infrastructure that Juniper was running on behalf of the community wasn't necessarily compatible with what the Linux Foundation could support. Because again, the way the Linux Foundation really works is it's almost a managed service provider. It has sort of a structure so that it can get some leverage and scale to support a number of different open source projects. I think the number of foundations you said was 130, Casey? There's like 130 sub-foundations in Linux Foundation?
I think it's over 200 now.
And how many open source projects does that represent roughly? Thousands, tens of thousands? Yeah, so there are thousands of projects that the Linux Foundation supports. And when you come and join, part of what they're doing is saying, since everybody's has a CI/CD build system, and everybody has, a wiki, and everybody has a bug tracking system, we're going to standardize all that across all the projects and get some economies of scale, make sure that the community is not doing sort of the undifferentiated heavy lifting and fiddling with bits that don't make sense. But the downside of that is that they've got to standardize, right? Just like any managed service provider. And so we wound up having a lot of stuff that wasn't really very compatible. So how to get from the Launchpad bug tracking system to Jira, how to get from our existing CI/CD system, which is based on Zool, to Jenkins and so on, that's all become kind of like just process and logistical issues, things that we have to jump through in order to finalize the transition. So that's part of why there was a lot of friction this year. But we're pretty much close to the end of that whole process. And so going into next year, we shouldn't be worried about all the blocking and tackling and be more focused on evangelism, getting the word out, adding new features, doing cool stuff with Tungsten Fabric. I think I've talked about a bunch of this, so I'm not going to spend too much time. I don't know how I'm doing on time here. Pretty close. All right. Okay, so this is what we need to do in 2019. Okay, by the end of Q1, I don't know if we're going to get there. We're already very close, but assuming no meteors. I'd like no more dependency on Juniper, right? So right now, one of the things, for example, that's a problem is that the builds and releases are still done by Juniper. So Juniper decides when a community release comes out. For me, that's unacceptable. I work there, and it's still unacceptable, right? And it's bad for Juniper too, because Juniper gets too used to the fact that they get to choose when to drop a release, and they're not used to, I have to consume the community release and integrate it into my release. And the sooner we get that complete separation, the better it is for everybody, even them, because then they have to really sort of participate as a seat at the table, not multiple seats. Expand the developer base, right? As we're going into the LFN, one of the key requirements they'd like to see is we try to grow up through the different stages of a project within the LFN, as they want to see more developer diversity, right? There's still a predominance of Juniper developers in Tungsten Fabric. So we're always going out to folks who use Tungsten Fabric and saying, look, we really want you to show up. And being a developer, or at least a contributor, doesn't always mean writing code. It could mean just helping us with the documentation. Once we get the CI/CD system transitioned, one of the biggest values of having this diverse community that we have is to get a lot of people involved with the testing, because everybody's got very different use cases, whether it's NFVI or something else. And so getting involved with the testing, making sure that we've got a very strong, very robust test system, and that the releases of the community are in good shape. That's all high value stuff that you can contribute to. I think that we need to increase our focus on China. China is a completely untapped market for Tungsten. It is a market that values open source very highly, but also has very complicated security and networking requirements. So we have unique value that we can provide there. But what you see inside of China is a very high focus on Open vSwitch, and really no understanding that there can be other kinds of data planes or approaches that are open source based. And so we really want to see folks starting to focus, Tungsten Fabric focusing more on China and getting Chinese developers and end users more involved. We want to get to be part of the Kubernetes ecosystem, right? I personally think that Kubernetes is a unique opportunity. I think many people here probably do. If you remember the early days, we had Docker, we had Mesos, we had Kubernetes. Who's going to win? Well, somebody won. That's nice, right? It's nice because it means that we can say, okay, if Kubernetes is the winner, for sort of the baseline of your application architectures going forward in the future, then we can just assume Kubernetes is everywhere, and we can really make our stuff work really, really well with Kubernetes. And so we need to get there. We need to get in. We need to integrate with the service meshes, and we need to show the value of Tungsten Fabric to the Kubernetes ecosystem and why things like Calico just won't cut it for large-scale, multi-cloud, distributed deployments.
Yeah, question.
Yeah.
So with the OCI in place, it should not matter a lot for you.
With what?
With the OCI in place, Open Container Initiative in place,
Mhm.
the runtimes are pretty much standard, right?
I believe so.
It should not matter for you whether it is Kubernetes or Swarm or something else, right? This is clear.
So the question is, our alternative architectures besides Kubernetes, do we care about those? Well, so I'm not a container expert, right? So take this with a grain of salt, and I don't know a ton about OCI, Open Container Initiative. What I do know is that Kubernetes has a very specific way of laying out the network with the pods and the way that it scales. And I don't think that that's necessarily replicated in something like Swarm. Swarm has its own kind of infrastructure architecture. And so if somebody wants to come into Tungsten Fabric and say, hey, let's go make this work super well with Swarm, that's fine. Nobody's going to stop them. I'm telling you that I think it's a higher priority to make our stuff work really well with Kubernetes and this particular architecture and the service meshes that are evolving into kind of standardized ways to do the deployments than it is for us to spend more time on, say, like Swarm. That's just my opinion. This is what I think the priority should be. I'm just one person. You can take it or leave it.
No, I'm just.
You can jump in.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm done.
The full value versus Calico, what do you pick up Calico? Is that because that's another rerouter solution? Or?
Calico is really the 800-pound gorilla in the Kubernetes ecosystem. It's sort of when people want a networking solution for Kubernetes, they usually wind up with Calico. So if you're going to go in and you want to be the number one, you need to displace the number one. And I don't want to go in anywhere unless I'm going to be number one. I don't know about you guys. I'm never playing for second or third or fourth. I'm playing for first, right? And so Calico's in first. So I have to show the value of Tungsten Fabric versus Calico.
Yeah. With Tungsten Fabric and Service Mesh, are you service mesh agnostic or do you have one?
We are service mesh agnostic. I don't think that battle's been, fought to completion yet.
Well, Calico is working with Istio pretty heavily.
We have demos working with Istio. I'm pretty sure we have some people who have actually put it together with Envoy. I don't know what kind of shape that stuff's in, whether it's production quality or not, but I know that we need to get there.
Are you going to talk more about how you're going to keep Calico and what the problems are, or do you want to touch on it quickly?
I'm not sure right now is the best venue. I'll give you my 30 seconds on it, but I have some, I'm trying to take a data-driven approach, so I have some initiatives where I'm actually doing evaluations versus Calico, so I can make claims that are based off of actual data rather than assertions. But my own personal experience as a backbone engineer at one point is that running BGP on a host is really not a great idea. Right? If you're going to push BGP down onto the host where the containers or VMs are going to run, that just seems like inherently you've brought the routing fabric down, the layer 3 routing fabric down to the host, which in my opinion is BGP is not a very secure protocol. You can make it secure, but I don't know if you've ever done it, but the level of filtering that you have to do and authentication between peers, it's pretty onerous. And unless that's all completely automated and bulletproof, I think that it's highly questionable how secure that can be. And so I think that there's some problems around the internal security architecture of Calico. I don't think it's designed for really big scale. And I don't really think that it's designed for a multi-cloud or multi-cluster. They're doing a good job of talking about security right now when you look at the sort of stuff that Tigera sends out. But it's really focused on the security that you get if you integrate like Istio. And so that's not Calico inherently.
We're also taking out a switch that you have versus a switch.
No, there, I think it's less of a versus and more sort of more an educational thing, right? I don't know where you are and how you think about things, but the way that I think about things is that whether it's layer 2 or layer 3 to a certain degree on the edge, on the leaf, I kind of don't care, right? Because I don't have a scalability problem there. I've got a scalability problem as I move up from the leaf, right? And so, you know, my biggest problem there is that, you know, many people, especially in China, you know, they sort of think that Open vSwitch is like the de facto correct way to do things in Linux, and that's what they want. They just want whatever ships with Linux. And so I think that's their perspective, and I think it's reasonable. I want open source. I want the standard stock stuff everybody uses. Why would you want me to add my own Linux kernel module? Which is why we have number 5 there, which I haven't gotten to yet. But you know, the notion of moving away from a specific vRouter that comes with Tungsten Fabric, and instead moving to an eBPF-based vRouter. So it's really, the vRouter disappears and is replaced by eBPF, and we just manage and control eBPF, and it provides all the functionality that's in vRouter. And then, you know, you got Linux, you got eBPF.
So that would be huge. That's the thing that kind of catches my attention on this slide. So if somebody can provide more details on that, would be awesome.
This is nascent. This is hot off the presses. Juniper just decided to like double down on this in the last week. So we got a couple architects looking at it, starting to engage with the community, and then we're going to start building blueprints going into Q1, and you know, try to hopefully work on an implementation and get it done before the end of Q2.
Yeah, because I can tell you for a fact that's, you know, in terms of evaluating options, solutions, right? It's one of the things that kind of goes on the con side for Tungsten, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
And we get it, and we're excited about it.
I'm not saying that there are tons of things that are on the positive side, but this is one thing that is.
There's always cons.
Yeah. And maybe, you know, maybe there were kind of good reasons as to why it was done the way it was done.
Well, you got to remember that it was implemented. The first code was written in 2012.
Right.
Right. So it's a pretty old project at this point, and there's no Kubernetes, there's no containers, right? And everything cloud native was all VM based. So so that made the most sense at that time to get the scale that we needed, not OVS. And so here we are, and we're continuing to make changes. And I think that if we build an eBPF based vRouter, that's like sort of like we continue to have our routed model instead of switched model, but now we're using a Linux kernel component that's standard as opposed to asking people to load our own Linux kernel module.
And any plans for VPP-based data plane for Tungsten Fabric?
VPP?
Yeah.
We have looked at it, but and we haven't. At least Juniper hasn't gotten comfortable with that yet. But I personally would love somebody in the Tungsten Fabric community to go do that. I believe that multi-data plane, multi-cloud, multi-cluster is our future, and having the Tungsten Fabric controller manage all that stuff is where the value is, right? Because right now, if we look at who runs us, it's mostly large carriers, some of the supercomputing centers, an odd enterprise here and there. But in my dream scenario, you've got sort of that same uptake on Amazon Web Services that you see with other open source projects, where people are basically starting to deploy Tungsten Fabric everywhere as part of their Kubernetes cluster because it just makes sense to them. They're like, oh, I don't want Calico, I need this other stuff, and so they do it, and it's really easy. And then suddenly you've got 10 or 100 developers at Enterprise A that are using it, and you can go to Enterprise A and say, you've got all these clusters. It turns out you could actually aggregate these into a single controller, then you get a single view into all of your networks across all the public clouds, a single view into security posture across all the clouds. And that's just like super, super high value. And I can see us getting into the enterprise and getting into the IT teams in the enterprise very successfully by doing that, because nobody's really sort of nailed that yet. And so we've got the capabilities and technology in place. As we add support for more data planes, it just becomes more and more compelling.
So what are data planes? Like looking at contract controller peering with OBS, for example, is supposed to.
We look. Are we?
I mean, it's a valid question, right? I mean, that's what you just said, right?
Yeah, no. I if somebody wants to do OBS, that's great. We haven't. Juniper. It's really hard to.
Right.
Juniper hat. Juniper hat. We haven't looked at that seriously because we just don't think it works.
But when you say multiple data planes,
yeah, VPP, FDIO.
Right.
The eBPF based vRouter, public cloud VPCs. which we support today. Basically anything that's sort of more of a routed type approach where the data plane's sort of a layer 3 routing component. Physical switches. Yeah, okay, great. Yes, one more.
One more, because I read an article about different CNI for Kubernetes, and there was only one sentence about
Yeah, about why they didn't include Tungsten Fabric?
Yes,
I read that one.
the kernel,
Yeah.
and just like this, and there is plan for this kernel update or remove dependency or special.
Yeah, well, obviously things like eBPF would make that go away. Oh, sorry. There was a recent article that evaluated the performance of a number of Kubernetes CNI plugins, and Tungsten Fabric was not in the list that was evaluated because we didn't have support for the kernel version that they were running. One of the challenges, just so you're aware, as a community, right? Okay, so we're a community. We're all working together. Juniper is one element to that community, and just like you would expect, the members of the community all have their own interests. What makes the community powerful is that there's a diversity of those interests, so different people in the community will come and help fix or update or change Tungsten Fabric to address the things that they need, right? If Juniper goes and just trying to fix stuff for the entire community, then you're just a Juniper customer. I don't think anybody wants that, right? So the thing that you have to keep in mind is that when Juniper's thinking about priorities, the vast majority of the customers that are running Tungsten Fabric are carriers. And so they always say they want the latest thing, they want the latest thing, they want the latest thing. We give them the latest thing, and then they don't want to change it ever because it's running in production. Don't update it. So we have constant arguments about, how late we're going to provide support for how many years. We got people running 2.x and 3.x of Contrail, which is the same as Tungsten, 4-year-old versions in production that they don't want to change or update. So, kind of to your point, that once the build system's out, hopefully here at the end of this month or early in Q1, and it's really part of the community, then getting more people involved, getting the tests in place for lots of different versions of Linux, different Linux kernels, and so on, will help us detect when there are problems, and then we can go in and we can fix and update the code for those specific versions. But that's really got to be a group effort, right? It can't, again, Juniper hat, Tungsten Fabric hat. I need everybody in the community to step up if we're going to get it done, right? It's not just Juniper. Okay. Yes, I know. Quite a few. Okay, so ongoing DPDK. This is just a quick list. You can look at this offline of where we are integrating with and working with other open source projects. I think most people get it. The only thing I'd say here is that more and more we're seeing lean in from people who are doing edge-based projects, whether it's a Crano or Starling, and we have some very specific features in Tungsten Fabric, like LLGR and the ability, that's headless mode, right? And the ability to run in a disconnected manner so that you can have a vRouter that's running at the edge that talks to a remote Tungsten Fabric controller, and then if it's disconnected and can't talk to the controller for a period of time, everything continues to run. So we do have some unique capabilities with Tungsten Fabric that make us more compelling for the edge. And if you want more information, you should talk to Sukhdev back there. Raise your hand about edge stuff. He is kind of leading the charge on that for us.
I actually
Okay.
got a question, and Sukhdev knows about it. We talked extensively about the ML2 support.
Yes.
Has there been a change since the last time we talked about this?
We've been contributing quite a bit to it.
Okay. You and I can think about this, please. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Okay, if you're not involved already, get on the mailing list, list.tungsten.io. Super easy, right? Get on the Slack. I hate Slack, but I'm still on it. And that's where to find me on Twitter or LinkedIn. And I'm done. I'm only over by far too many minutes.
You can take it out mine.
Oh. Valentine. Oh, wait, sorry.
Yeah.
Madison.
Yes.
Thank you, Randy. That excellent